Thanks everyone for joining the fourth and final, at least for now, Running Science Happy Hour. I'm going to be sort of letting people in as I start the introduction here from the waiting room. So bear with me. Okay, so before we get started, many of you are familiar faces from previous sessions. As always, I want to start by thanking Novell USA, Maria and Susan, who have jumped on the call again today for supporting the series. Again, the series started, I don't know, February sometime, and I was very thankful that Novell would come in and help out and be the sponsor for the series. It's gone very well. It's been great to see a bunch of familiar faces and new faces and making new friends and colleagues along the way. So Novell, just to give you, for those of you that have just this is your first session, they do quite a bit to help biomechanics related events and sessions and conferences, and they're definitely a world leader in force measurement instruments in the field. And so, yeah, just really fitting that they were willing to help out with this, and really thankful for their help. Their product that have gotten quite a bit of attention lately are the load soles, the wireless insoles that measure vertical forces. Lots of really cool research and practical applications. So thanks again, Maria and Susan. And if you want to say a few words as usual, hop on.
Thanks, Max. We really appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this. It is something a little bit different, I think, than a lot of our typical interactions, and really great to meet new people and understand new perspectives on similar discussions that we have a lot. So that's really great. And thank you for this opportunity. And I'll stick a link to our website in the chat again. So if there's anything you want to follow up, and put my email in there too. Sorry about that. Any questions you have, just let us know. And we can't wait to hear how things go today in this final discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. And Maria, it sounds like you guys have a pretty strong deal going on right now with the load sole. Feel free to mention that, please.
Sure. Yeah, there's a great one, a great special offer right now with the load sole. We've had a really great success in last fall with an interview series we did called Crosstalk. That's on our website as well. And it was all about how things have changed in terms of remote data collection, remote learning, telehealth, all of this kind of different collection that we're all forced to do, and understanding when we don't have direct access with people anymore. And then we also had a sponsorship of a National Biomechanics Day contest that went really great, and the winner was just announced last week for that. Also along those same lines of how you would use this technology in those kinds of applications. And we really got so many great abstracts. I mean, it was just amazing. So hopefully, even, I don't know if any of those people happen to be on here today, but if they can take advantage of this great offer we have, that would be awesome too. So yeah, that's listed on our Twitter as well as in the news section on our website. So awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, so just before we get started, so again, the quick background, the idea was that, no conferences, at least in person, and I know there's a lot of virtual conferences and whatnot, and which, although the science is great and everything is fun, we don't get to see people or hang out or, have a drink or whatever. And so the idea here was that, we could bring some people together that are interested in running science specifically, and then have invited a special guest to come in and give their perspective on some of the topics. And so we've had Dathan Ritzenheim, Aisha Pratt-Lear, and then Ben Rosario. And then our fourth session today, we'll have our final invited guest. So it's gone well. The format that I'll be using is I ask people to post questions or email me questions, and I've gotten a bunch of questions on this today. And so I've got a list of things, and it'll be sort of a moderated Q&A type of format. And then as it typically does, the discussion sort of grows and evolves organically, and we kind of go from there, and that's absolutely fine and sort of the point of this whole thing. So I'll stop talking now, and I will introduce our final invited speaker. Very excited for this one. So our guest is an entrepreneur. She's co-owner of Picky Bars, has her own clothing line. I'm repping it right now. Grit, has a coaching business with her husband, Ben, does a lot of things, all sorts of things, almost too many to discuss now. And I can let her talk about that a bit, but professional distance runner. Some people call her a marathoner, but she's just a really, really world-class distance runner. 15, 17, 5,000 meter PR, 31, 24, 10,000 meter PR. That's very, very fast, by the way. 1:10 half marathon, and then 2:27 marathoner. Super mom, the two awesome little boys, Riley and Hudson. Just an overall stand-up human being. So Steph, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today.
Max, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to talk to everyone today.
Awesome. By the way, I want to point out that's not a virtual background in Steph's video. That's really a background in Phoenix. It's gorgeous there, it looks like. So thanks for joining us, Steph. We got a bunch of questions. I'll start off, pretty standard question for a professional runner is to really kind of get your some info from you about how you started running and sort of your journey to now in a summary type format.
Sure. So, yeah, I would say when I was in grammar school, we had PE classes, physical education, and we had to do a series of exercises like the sit and reach, pull-ups, and then one of the events was the mile shuttle run. And I just remember like really being drawn to that one event because I couldn't do a pull-up. I could barely touch my toes. And the mile run was the one event where I felt like I could beat boys in the PE class. And that got me like very excited as I was the youngest of 4 children. I have 3 older brothers. So you could always say like I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder against boys. So I think just like naturally, I like really got into the fitness side of it and just the competitive and, like having this like carefree fun as a middle schooler. And then as I got into high school, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. I remember the cross country coach asked me, he had heard about some sprints that I did in PE class. And he was like, hey, are you interested in coming out for cross country? And I was like, what's cross country? And he's like, well, you run kind of a varying amount of like distance over different terrains. Sometimes it's 2.7, sometimes it's 3.1. I was like, that sounds like a really random sport. I don't really know about this. And he was like, why don't you just come out one day? So I came out and tried out for the team on my freshman year, and luckily I made the team. But then I would say the next like 2 to 3 years of my high school career, I was very much interested in being a high school kid who partied, who showed up late, who rarely went to practice, much to the chagrin of my coach, who like really felt like I had potential. But I really just wasn't interested in running. I did not like it at all. I thought it was an awful sport. It was 100 degrees when we practiced in Phoenix during track practice. And I was like, this is just not for me. And at the time, I was living with my mom in Phoenix, and my father had been diagnosed with prostate cancer earlier in my life when I was 12. But towards the end of my high school career, his health was declining, and he was getting cancer treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. And basically halfway through my senior year, I just felt like something was kind of off. So I decided to book a flight, and I flew out there right before my track season started. And I flew out on a Friday morning, and we had some family friends that were living in Long Island at the time. And so I was going to stay with them and then take the train into Manhattan to see my dad and my stepmom on Saturday. And I woke up Saturday morning, I went for a run, and I remember just having a very strange feeling on that run, something that to this day is still very hard to describe. And when I got back from that run, my stepmom was on the phone and she said, "Stephanie, your dad passed away." And of course I said, "No, I'm about to go see him right now. That's impossible." And she's like, "No, he passed away in the last hour." And so what I realized at that moment was, I think that feeling that I had, that strange, just like feeling that took over me, he died while I was on that run. And I think, maybe he passed through me. I wasn't a very spiritual person, but I just thought that's the only connection I could make. And so, honestly, from 18 years old, it completely changed the trajectory of my life. And I felt like there were two paths I could take after losing my dad. And I decided to no longer look at running as something that I had to do, but it was something that I get to do. And it became a gift. And then I've just never looked back. And running has been a huge part of my life. I feel like in a way it saved my life, because, having lost my dad, my brothers all reacted to losing our father differently. And one brother went down the path of drugs and addiction. And then I went down the path of running. And I really feel like it just set me up to have all these great opportunities in my life. And so that's how I got started running. And yeah, I've never looked back since I was 18.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Steph. I think it's clear that running has various effects on people, and for the various reasons, and that's a really good example of that. And so then you went to you continued on, and you are where you are now, and then you went to college, and then so where did you go to college, and then what was your transition to pro running like? I know you
Sure.
weren't always in Flagstaff, for example.
Correct. Yeah. So I ended up getting a partial scholarship. Well, I guess this is part of it. Before my father passed away, my mile time was 5:28 as a junior. And since, like I said, something mentally shifted in me, and I just felt like I wasn't trying hard enough and I wasn't giving my everything. When I went back to that track season a month later, I ended up taking my mile time down to 4:58, and I took second in the state meet in Arizona. So I had a huge improvement over that 1 year. And then I got the attention of like a couple colleges, not big time colleges, but UC Santa Barbara. I got the attention of Coach Pete Dolan. And so he was able to offer me a partial scholarship to UCSB. And when I got there, of course, like everyone in high school, I was like, "I'm a miler." And I got there and he's like, "You're actually a 10,000 meter runner." And I was like, "What?" But it's very clear now, like looking at my stride and looking at like all the strengths that I have in different workouts, that he was very much like on the right track. But what was cool when I look back now, I don't think I was very fast for like a high schooler. Because people do call me a marathoner, and that is my strongest event. But I look back at a couple of things in high school, and I ran 59 seconds in the 400 meter on a 4x4. I ran 2:16 in 800, and then 4:58 in the mile. So it showed that I had the tools. I was just very underdeveloped. And I give a lot of credit to my high school coach, because in high school, we only ran about 30 to 35 miles a week. And I credit him because I think that's why at 37 years old, I'm now running my best times, because I had such a slow, healthy development in the sport, and I never rushed anything. Like female health was like such a nice progression. I had a great view and perspective on body image. So I really was like brought up in a very great environment. And then same thing, my college coach, he was like, "I don't know if you want to run after college, but I want to give you that opportunity." So each year I just slowly went from, it was like 50 miles my first year, freshman year, 60 to 70, sophomore year, 70 to 80, and then 80 my senior year. I had a fair amount of injuries in college, and that was a mixture of not finding out that I had some food allergies and I had celiac disease. And so I actually just wasn't recovering as well as I should. I had very low iron towards the end of my senior year. And that was probably my first introduction to the effects of how blood levels can really like have an impact on a athlete's performance. Because I had a really great race halfway through the year, and then about 6 weeks later, I started to tank, and I had no idea why. And when the school decided to do like a CBC panel, they tested me, and my iron was 4. My ferritin level, and they said, one, how are you running, let alone kind of just walking, because that was apparently a very, very low level. So that also gave me a little bit of, I don't know if encouragement's the right word, but it made me feel like there was always something better around the corner. Like I wasn't at my potential when I was in college. But the times I had run, you would not think that I would dream about being a professional runner. I graduated with a 33:20 PR in the 10K, 16:12 in the 5K, nothing really garnering too many sponsors or a professional contract. But I just had the stubborn belief in myself. And so I did what I needed to do for 3 years. I called it, I just hustled. I cleaned houses, I nannied. I did anything I could to like make money, but then train in the morning, train in the evening. And I just kept getting hurt, but I just kept believing that there was more in me. And probably after about 3 years of trial and error from 2008 to 2011, I decided to email all the coaches in the country. And I just said, this may seem crazy, but I really feel like I've found the missing piece of, you know, why I've been plagued with injuries. And I really feel like I can be one of the best marathoners in the US. Would you coach me? And it was the most bold, audacious, like who writes that to all these coaches? And I just sent it out. I'm talking like all the professional coaches. I heard back from one. And that coach ended up saying he followed me in college and he kind of believed that I was right. And so he said, come out to Flagstaff. We're starting a group out there. That was the McMillan Adidas group. So I moved out there in April of 2010, trained under him. And then 8 months later is when I ran 2:29:30 in the marathon. And that was the 6th fastest time by an American at the time. So that kind of catapulted my professional running career. And then got me to Flagstaff. And then through some, you know, trials and tribulations, that team kind of fizzled out. But then I was able to meet Coach Ben Rosario, who moved out, and he really wanted to start a professional group. Met him in 2012, and then our group signed with Hoka 2.5 years later, and I've been with them ever since.
Yeah, so that's I think that's probably a part that most collegiate athletes don't understand. It's like you don't just like, people don't just knock at your door all the time and say, hey, you want to join our group? It's like, hey, you got to kind of ask at times. And because, you know, it's pretty rare that athletes are at the level where, you know, they're given everything on a silver platter right out of college. And so I didn't even know that story, Steph. So that's cool. I didn't know that aspect. Well, okay. So really good background. Steph mentioned, you know, you've been doing this for a while now, really strong progression. You're now, you know, running the best that you ever have. All your PBs are like from the last few years, 2 years maybe. You know, obviously the group NAZ Elite, there's a lot going on. You guys do all sorts of stuff. And, you know, let's talk a little bit about injury to start. You know, recently you've had some plantar issues and that sort of started last fall, and maybe climaxed at the worst case at the Marathon Project, and then you've been kind of working back with that. So there was a question about that specifically, and about the Marathon Project, and the question was, you know, you had to step off the course due to pain at the Marathon Project, and I guess we could talk about the rehab aspect of it, but this question was specifically about if you could give context leading up to the marathon. You know, were you feeling it before? Did it start during? And then kind of how did you feel like when it started in the race? What was your thought process?
Sure. So first off, I didn't realize plantar fasciitis was like the equalizer injury that I feel like everyone in the running industry has either had, because the amount of feet pictures that I get sent and random advice is amazing.
Yikes.
Sorry, it's weird here, but it is amazing how it's an injury that I feel like really plagues a lot of people, and people come at it from very different angles. And I think the reason why it sticks around for some people is very different. So my experience, if I would probably date it back to like November of 2020. I had just run Max's 5K that in Memphis, actually, on the road. And I think it started with just like a slight irritation in my heel. Like after a couple of workouts, I was like, oh, okay, I feel like a little twinge, but I don't really know what that is. I'm just training hard. It's probably nothing. And context for you, I have little things that pop up all the time, but I am not someone that ever runs through pain. Like there's running through pain in races, and then there's running through pain in workouts and training. And I have never like run through pain. And I think that's what has led to my longevity in my career. I really hadn't had an injury before planner for about 8 years. And I really pride myself on listening to my body and resting when it needs. So I started to feel that little twinge in my heel. And then about a week and a half before I was supposed to run a 10K on the track, we had been in our like Hoka flats most of the season because we were getting ready for the marathon. And then track access was really null and void for us, but we needed to get in spikes before we were running this 10,000 on the track. So we did one workout about 8 days before this track 10K. And so I got a little reintroduction to spikes and then back into my flats. And then, yeah, I lined up on December 5th for the 10,000 meter where I was trying to run the Olympic standard. And about with 9 laps to go, I remember feeling like this distinct shift in my stride. And then I just had a lot of pain in my heel those last 8 laps. And I kind of just like grinded my way through. Luckily, I barely got the Olympic standard by half a second. That's where I ran 31:24 and the standard was 31:25. But then I like could not walk after the race and I could barely cool down. And I said, something is like really wrong. And then I woke up the next morning and it was like a dagger was in my foot when I put my foot down on the ground. I couldn't like walk normally on it. So I ended up taking the next 2 days off because now I was 2 weeks out from the marathon. And I thought, okay, I'll just rest it a little bit. Tried to do a 3-mile run 2 days later, and then it still wasn't good. So we said, you know what, let's see if we can calm it down. So I took 3 full days off. And for me, off is off. I didn't cross train because at this point, I'm not trying to save any fitness. I knew I was super fit. I just needed to like send everything in my body to recover. And I got a lot of aggressive treatment. I had like work done in my calf, work done on my ankle, making sure my hip and my adductor on that side were like firing well. And each morning it was very painful to get out of bed, but then like it would loosen up a little bit. And then the start of runs were really bad and it would get slightly better. And they were taping the bottom of my heel. And then we said, all right, well, I'm going to have to do like a test workout to see if I can run this marathon. So I did a workout 4 days before, which was 2 miles at marathon pace, some 400s, and then another 2 miles. And it actually felt pretty good. Like the planner was there, but I felt like I could run and my stride was fairly normal. But I imagine that was because I was tapering and resting anyway. So I was pretty hopeful like for the race. And so my coach gave me the green light. Then I started the race and within probably like 3 or 4 miles, I just started to have heel pain pretty quickly. And then it just went up the chain. I started running differently. My hip started to hurt. Then my gait was off and I was limping. And I just made that really tough call at 17 miles to be like, this is not worth it. I'd already started slowing down because I didn't have enough like power, energy. I'm like, I didn't come here to run 2:30 something in the marathon. And I thought maybe I would do more damage than good. But it was a difficult decision because I do not like dropping out of races. I've only dropped out of one other marathon, one other race my whole career. I don't mind having bad results next to my name. So I do not like dropping out, but this felt like I was saving my body for the remainder of my career.
Right. So All right, so you step off the course. Obviously, it's just kind of a, it's always tough to deal with. Not necessarily, yeah, sure, because you're not performing the race that you want, but then you might also be thinking like, okay, this might linger for a while. Like how, what's going to happen. So what's like as a pro runner, where like obviously performance, is driving your career in a way as a runner. What goes through your mind now? You're on the side of the road, right? People are flying by. You've got the Olympic year coming up. So how, like, can you give context about like what does an injury do to a professional athlete of your caliber here?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is I feel like I let everyone down. Like the way the course was, it was a loop course. So you go by, you kind of do like, let's say 2 balloons almost. And so you see the same people 7 different times throughout the marathon. And my kids were on one end. And then the last time I turned, like they were cheering for me. And I just wanted to say, like, I'm not coming around again, you guys, but I couldn't obviously tell them that. So then, of course, they don't see me. And then it kind of makes me feel like crap all the times that I'm like away from my kids and now I dropped out of this race. So now is it worth it? Like all the selfish hours that I'm spending training, but it is my job and it is my profession. And then you feel like you're letting your therapist down who've been helping you, or my husband, Ben. But then you realize like that's all BS, because obviously those people don't really care about those things and you're not letting them down. So I kind of go through all of that within a quick couple minutes. And then my whole family had come out because it was Phoenix. And, my mom is battling late stage metastatic breast cancer, and they got her out the door to come to the course. And then I drop out. So I had a lot of guilt at first. But I know that that's not what my family and friends really care about. They just want me to, be happy, and whatever that looks like on paper. So then after a little pity party for myself, I said, you got to get over it and you got to get back on the horse. But the hard part is sometimes the horse doesn't mean training. The horse for me meant I needed to rest. So I basically took the next, I was just kind of testing it. I had no idea, but I took the next 5 weeks totally off. I didn't cross train one day. I just rested. And I would say that is my strength, that I'm very confident in myself as an athlete, that I don't feel like I needed to cross train, because this late in my career, I don't need any more aerobic development. I just need to recover and, get ready to train hard. But it was a frustrating 5 weeks, because besides just the resting, like every morning was, before I step out of bed, massage my foot, take off my Velcro strap boot, heat it up, like literally before I put my feet on the ground. Sometimes I would crawl to the bathroom because my foot hurt so much. And then you're questioning, is this a really dumb sport that I'm doing? I'm in this much pain. Or like if my kid had a bad night, I couldn't run into his room in the middle of the night because my foot would hurt so much. So it's a strange sport that we do. Because you think you're like, I know I'm not being unhealthy through it, but you can have such an injury like this, like be very debilitating. And then it made me want to be like, well, how can I help everyone else who has this? How can I help them not have these problems? But I also realized as a pro, I have access to the best people who can watch me, who can tell me, oh, you're actually just not getting hip extension on your left hip, so you're slamming your heel into the ground. And that's literally why I have plantar. I'm just landing really hard on my heel. So as soon as I can change that, I can get out of pain. And over the last 8 to 9 weeks, I have slowly progressed from a 3-mile run one day, a 4-mile run the next day, to 8 weeks later, I have 18 miles coming up this Sunday. So a lot of rehab, a lot of patience, a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I wrote a big blog about it on my website too, if you want more detail.
So you mentioned, okay, there's a bunch of biomechanists here on the call. A lot of nerdy biomechanists out here waiting for biomechanics related things. So I'll talk about that for a bit. So you mentioned a couple of things. So you mentioned, you land hard on your heel. And you mentioned, form before and whatnot. And so, So when you say like you have people in your corner watching and helping, and so can you kind of just, before we go into some maybe mechanical details, like what's the support system look like for you? Like you got an injury, what's your first step? Like who do you talk to? And then what's the next, kind of what's the hierarchy there?
Yeah, so we work with two chiros in Flagstaff, AJ and Wes Gregg of Hypo2 Sport. They've been in the practice for 5 to 7 years. So Wes is kind of like my go-to. So great thing about Pro Athlete, like I'm on a tech-based relationship with him. Like I can text and call him kind of anytime, and he would come and see me or get me in to see him like right away. Yeah, so he kind of walks through things with me, and he'll ask me a series of like, does it hurt when you do this? Is it more painful after the run? Does it get better? And then I also have a therapist in Phoenix, Dr. John Ball, who he's been my therapist for 12 plus years, who is just the guru. And he'll always find the problem that, like yesterday, I saw him, he didn't touch my foot once. And I was like, are you sure you don't want to work on my planner? And he was like, no, it's your hip extension, and your pelvic tilt. So he's able to kind of like step back and not just focus right on where you think your pain area is. And then, of course, we have Coach Ben, who kind of talks through the process of, okay, should we take time off? Should we like progress slower? But then for me, since I'm older in my career, I usually have a pretty good idea of what I think I need. And I've just gone off gut instinct throughout dealing with this planner, where I'm like, you know what, it felt worse like today than yesterday. So I'm going to probably take today off. And I would just use those principles for me. And then, yeah, they usually can film us on a treadmill or film us on a workout and slow the footage down. And they're able to just break apart like a lot of, what we have going on.
All right. Well, yeah. So so that makes sense. I think it's something that a lot of us who study running injuries, we might study recreational runners, and they don't have the kind of support that you might, or other pros might have. So it's always different, right, to hear from pro runners who've got all these people around them. So in terms of biomechanics, Steph, you mentioned that, John, for example, will say, oh, we'll work on this and this because that's causing your planner. And we're like, some of us are spending our careers like trying to figure out like what causes injuries, right? And so when someone tells you like, okay, this is the problem or this is the problem, like there's the therapy aspect, but what about like the form aspect of it? Like how is that something that the therapist will tell you, okay, like you need to change this, or will that be Ben Rosario that'll say, okay, we'll do these drills or whatnot, or how do you approach, or if at all, changing form if needed?
Yeah, I think for me and for Coach Ben, like we have never liked the form change because you were born with a certain form. And so the goal is to just be the best version of your own form. Like I'm never going to look like Shalane Flanagan. I'm never going to have Molly Huddle's like stride, but my stride has worked for me. And so when you want to change it or work on it is when your form keeps you in the injury cycle. So for me, we're looking at, okay, why did this planner happen? What injury cycle have I gotten in? And mine was simple. I was running so many miles to train for the marathon that I was sitting in the bucket, meaning I was like, my pelvis was really like turned in. And if you can imagine, a runner just sitting in the bucket. And so I was not having great hip extension. And now I'm trying to run 5-minute pace or faster to get back on the track. And my body's like, I don't know how to do that because you've been trying to run like 5:30 to 5:40 pace for so many years, and running 115 miles a week really slow kind of like gets you out of that sprint cycle. So it's really a matter of addressing it when an injury cycle is happening. And then Coach Ben comes in when it comes to like form drills and things that we have twice a week. And that really is not necessarily to change our form, but to make us better athletes, to make us, to prevent injury, and then to make us just be more dynamic. So all those little quick feet is less time on the ground, but he's not trying to change anyone's form. But I think once you do those things over time, your form will just inevitably improve. And that might seem like a change, but you're really just improving your version of yourself.
Right, and that makes sense. I think that's something that a lot of professional athletes understand. But the people that are looking at professional athletes, right, the high school kids, the college kids who are like, oh, I need to look like Steph or Shalane or whoever, sometimes. And Dathan spoke about this, how, they were trying to make him run like Bekele for a while, and it's like it didn't work.
Yeah, he was injured, right?
Right, exactly, constantly. So Steph, you mentioned less time on the ground, and Paul DeVita is on the call. Paul's thing about running injuries is he says we need to eliminate any time on the ground, basically. Eliminate the stance phase, problem solved. So less time on the ground, that's going to be basically, in a way, it's going to be, faster steps, shorter steps, higher cadence, if you will. So we have Dr. Lace Ludke on the call. Lace, I think you're here. I don't see you now, but Lace has done some research with regards to cadence and injuries, and in high school runners and potentially other populations now. But Lace, would you mind kind of chatting a bit about cadence and then what you found about that with regards to injury?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the initial research that we did was on high school cross-country runners. And we assessed their cadence or their step rate, their numbers of steps per minute, at the very start of their high school cross-country season. And we measured their step rate at a consistent pace. So all of the runners were assessed at an 8-minute per mile pace, as well as having them assessed at their self-selected pace. So they were encouraged to run at the pace they did the vast majority of their training mileage at during the course of the week. So we could capture their step rate at a consistent speed and make comparisons when speed was held fairly constant, as well as getting an idea of what their step rate was for most of their training mileage during the course of the week. Because some of them averaged quite a bit faster than 8 minutes per mile for their typical training pace, and some of them averaged quite a bit lower or slower than that. And what we found during the course of the season had those values from the start of the season, and then tracked knee and shin injuries that occurred during their September, October, November season that took place. So any injuries to the anterior knee and to the shin that were diagnosed by their school's athletic trainer and resulted in lost time. So either one or more missed practices or competitions. And what we found is those runners with low step rates, and we did a couple different analyses. Essentially, the runners who were kind of in this 166 to 168 steps per minute or less tended to be more likely to experience a shin injury during the course of that cross-country season. We expected we were going to see a similar relationship with anterior knee pain as well, but in deciding to study anterior knee pain, we only had 3 cases of it during the season, so not enough cases of that for us to find a significant relationship.
So in essence, it sounds like a higher cadence was better, and it sort of kind of goes back to, would the mechanism be related to less time on the ground? Is that sort of the believed mechanism there, or less time to apply force to the body? What's the thought there?
So essentially, yes, higher injury rates in those with the lower step rates, and less shin injury in those with the higher step rates. And when in our tertile analysis, it was 178 steps or higher, getting kind of close to that common 180 steps per minute that's often discussed in the running literature. We didn't measure ground contact time. We didn't measure the kinetics. So can't conclude that from our study, but based on other research that's been done, it could be related to that ground contact time, or those with low step rates are also potentially overstriding. And when we say overstriding, they're likely landing with that foot more anterior or out in front of their center of mass. Again, we didn't assess foot strike specifically, but with those low step rates, we also tend to see more heel strike compared to midfoot or forefoot strike. And I always like to try to qualify that heel strike in and of itself is not a bad thing, but if they're landing with a really heavy heel strike with the toes up in the air, or with kind of an increased foot ground angle, that has been associated with increased impact forces. So kind of looking at the landing posture when they're making that initial contact with the ground, the lower step rates have been associated with increased loading rates and impact forces. So thinking that's likely the mechanism. Ground contact time could play a role in there as well, but again, we didn't specifically assess that.
Got you. Thank you. So just, I know Steph and I have talked about this before. One time we were having dinner and I said, I bet your cadence sometimes goes up to 220. She goes, no, my cadence is always 180. And it's true, her cadence is pretty much always 180, but it does go up quite a bit, quite high as well at times. And so I think it's important, even though Steph does strike the ground with her heel, we got to remember that in professional runners, like their average paces for runs will be much faster than what we typically see potentially in research. And so, I'm just on Strava right now, and Steph ran 8 miles this morning, average 7:13 per mile pace. Her cadence was 182. If you're running 7:13 per mile, even if your heel strikes the ground, by the time the force is applied, your foot is flat on the ground, if that makes sense, right? So there's not much time to be in that position is my point here, because she's moving so fast. And then throw in the workouts and all that, it's even less time. So I think those are aspects that potentially we don't necessarily capture in the typical populations that we study, and it's likely a reason why it's hard to find consistent evidence on like strike patterns. And Dr. Allison Gruber is on the call, and Allison, you've done quite a bit of work with foot strike and systematic review, and we've talked about this before, but can you maybe just give us an idea of with the literature, and you've said this in a previous call, but why do you think that strike pattern is not the end all be all for injuries, obviously?
Well, I think the overall argument for changing your foot strike pattern has to do with reducing vertical loading rate and a moderately large number of studies, mostly retrospective, that have found increased vertical loading rates are associated with injuries. However, the evidence isn't that strong for in prospective studies, and even a study that came out from Irene Davis in MSSE last year found that vertical loading rates did not distinguish who got injured and who didn't. So I don't think it's a vertical loading rate problem, and vertical loading rates can be high in forefoot and midfoot runners, and they can be low in rear foot strike runners. And there was a great study by Brian Heiderscheit that came out last year showing that the relationship between foot strike pattern and vertical loading rate is not linear. So it can be all over the place. So I think it's just more multifactorial than foot strike pattern and vertical loading rates.
Right. And so again, like someone, like just to bring in Steph as an example, again, with a heel strike pattern, but if you watch Steph run, she doesn't bop a lot, right? And so less bopping, pretty efficient stride, pretty smooth looking stride. Even though she heel strikes, I would bet that her loading rate is quite low compared to some even forefoot strikers. I mean, Steph and Lauren, my wife, who are training together right now at NAZ, they run vastly differently. And Lauren, I guarantee you, has much higher loading rate despite her heel never actually touching the ground. And so just because of other factors. And we joke that if we put one of Steph's shoes, the forefoot aspect of Steph's shoes and the heel of Lauren's shoes, you can recycle brand new shoes effectively, because Steph runs on her heels and Lauren's heel never touched the ground.
Max, I have a good, I usually do this at the end to make it feel like we weren't on a boring Zoom, but I'll do it now since we're talking about stride rate. I'm just going to share a quick video, and this was in 2018. This was when I won my first national championship on the road. This is the 10K at Atlanta. But what's great about this is the last basically 2 minutes of the race, and it's slightly downhill. And then someone on the internet took the news clip and put LL Cool J, Mama Said Knock You Out. So it's kind of awesome. But I am running around like 4:30 to 4:35 mile pace for this clip. Tell me if you can see. All right.
See if I can make this bigger.
Watch that lead. How
Can you
things
see?
decide I'm getting second place. It really looks like that. Well, she used all her energy trying to go for that big lead, and Steph has now gone to the arm, pumping hard, and she's got the lead. Yeah, her form looks great. Over the years, when you talk about this event for the men and the women and the wheelchair athletes as well, Piedmont Park is the story is written. It is always the place where victories are made and defeat is taken. Well, that shows how strong the field is. You know, it's hard to get rid of that many good people. But Stephanie Bruce, 34 years of age, Northern Arizona elite. She was a PR of the North, and she was 29. And she was taking the race where Alabama was second.
I
Awesome.
overshot. What that taught me, what that race taught me was, yeah, I used to compare like different forms and think, you know, I would never be XYZ because I didn't have a certain form. But I was like, yeah, but my form can get me so many different places. And so it doesn't all have to look the same. And even though I do shuffle and don't have knee drive, like there's still power because I have power from my core and power from all other places. Yeah, that make my stride very fast at this point.
Right. Yeah, and it's one of those things like you mentioned before, like to me, and this is a big hot topic right now in our field in sports science and running injuries, is it's you know, people get really amped up about, you know, we've always said injuries happen when the tissue, basically the stress that are placed on the tissue exceed what they can handle, right? Which makes a lot of sense, but everybody's like losing their minds about like, you know, when someone proposes how we measure tissue capacity, it's like, it's never good enough. And it's really tough to do, right? Because you can't just take tissue out, measure it, put it back in. Just the reality of it. But sometimes I wonder, like, does it really matter how because, you know, you guys are doing everything you can, right? At the pro level, which, you know, Ross Miller and I have talked about this and Allison as well, many times before. Ross, I think, is on the call, but it was like, there's so many things that we are trying to do to find running injuries, but ultimately it might be worth studying you guys, elite runners, because you do absolutely everything that a runner could possibly do in training, you know, like strength training, therapy, mobility stuff, drills, sleep well, eat well. I mean, everything is good, you know, I would say on average, right? Like, so of course there's anomalies and some pro runners and they don't do all the right things, but and so, you know, arguably, my point is that if we could measure tissue capacity and we would say, okay, Steph, your tissue capacity is low, whatever that means, you would say, well, I'm doing everything, right? Like, I don't know, like I'm doing drills, I'm running, at times the questions in science are like, okay, how can we isolate things? Can we say this is more important than this? And every time I speak to professional athletes, the big thing is like, well, we do everything we can, right? And then we don't quite know exactly if one thing is better than the other, but ultimately it doesn't necessarily matter in an odd way. It's just like, this is how we train, and this is, so anyway, what are your thoughts, Steph, on, like, you know, if I were to tell you drills are useless, strength is useless, massages are useless, just go ahead and just run, right? Or whatever permutation of that, you know, in your experience, what would you say, you know, for your own, you know, performance or injury, you know, reduction?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably get injured running like 60 miles a week.
Yeah.
And it's sad because that is the majority of like the masses. And I think it's a disservice, you know, granted, I'll have a lot of people, you know, people are like, you're so inspirational, you're awesome. And I'm like, don't forget, like, I get paid to take naps. I get paid to lift. So like, I am actually not as inspirational as all of you guys who are just getting up and running and doing it with your full-time jobs. Like, I get paid to do all the things that keep me healthy. Now, granted, I'm also trying to train on the very edge of can I run 110 miles a week and run super fast intervals and hard long runs? So I need to do all those things, but I really have seen, probably when you guys are talking about foot strike and all that, I'll be honest, I don't really get into any of that stuff, and I don't try to get too concerned with how I'm landing, because I would go crazy doing that. But the one thing I do pay attention to is strength training. And I think if I'd have to attribute one thing that has kept me healthy, like coming back from pregnancy and postpartum and different than the college version of myself, is lifting heavy in the gym. That is what has kept me lean, healthy, strong, and honestly fast on the track, is strength training.
Well, that's great that you mentioned that, because again, another big debate. Us scientists love to debate, obviously. It's about, whether or not strength training is valuable, and there's evidence on sort of tissue studies and animal studies, well, not animal studies, but not necessarily pro runners anyway, that heavy strength training is the way to go for a number of reasons. But there's still a lot of doubt, right? Because science is kind of like that. I mean, that science is doubt in a way constantly, and it's never perfect, but it's the evidence on heavy strength training and performance is pretty good, as far as science goes anyway. But in terms of injury risk reduction or injury prevention, there's really nothing out there, at least nothing that's been done very well for what's actually being done in practice, like what athletes do. So it's interesting to hear you say that, and Aisha said the same thing. Right? I asked Aisha, I said, Aisha, the evidence on strength training and injury, and she kind of knows this because Joe does a lot of that research, and I said it's not very strong about heavy strength training and prevention, and I said sort of facetiously, what would you do if I told you, like, don't strength training, it's useless? And she says, I would laugh at you, basically, and here I am, like, here we are as scientists, like, we're the ones going over the literature and doing the research, but yet, like, athletes know it's hard to describe it, right? But like, in your experience, you've gone through this, and you feel this is what's helped you the most. So maybe that's a pointer for us scientists. We're all hypothesis driven, but often I think talking to the people in the trenches who've done it for a long time can be quite valuable. Ross, you have a question?
Sorry, more of a comment. Walter Herzog has said this for a while, so I'm totally stealing it from him. I think most people here know Walter, but for those who don't, he's a prominent biomechanics researcher who doesn't do a lot of research on running, mostly on tissue mechanics and cartilage and tendon and muscle and that sort of thing. But he's always been saying at conferences for the last 10 years or so that we're studying the wrong people when it comes to running injuries, or at least from the wrong perspective. We're trying to figure out, like, what injured runners do that's causing them to get injured. But along with, and this is kind of the same idea as Paul was saying a little while ago, everyone gets injured, right? Like, that's the norm in running. So maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here with trying to figure out, like, what are injury prone runners doing that's causing them to be injury prone, other than just the fact that it's kind of an inherently injurious thing. Maybe we should be studying, like, the rare, like, bulletproof people who can run 100 like hard miles a week and not get injured, and find out what are they doing, what's special about them. Maybe it's strength training, maybe it's something with their form, but whatever it is, maybe we need more studies on those people, on the ones who don't get hurt, not so many on the people who do get hurt.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. I lost my train of thought there and I improvised, but that's where I was going with that earlier, with that point that you had made before. And I would bet, and Steph, you'd probably agree with this, knowing how many pro runners there are so few of those bulletproof people. Everybody at some point, and you can talk about that, Steph, like how you're pushing boundaries constantly, and so, when you're trying to be the best you can be, you're trying to run 2:24 marathon as a 2:27 marathoner, it's like, that's a big jump. And you're trying, and obviously you can do it, but it's like, you have to push yourself all the time. Right. And so what's that red lining? How do you manage that with everything else? That you're trying to push your body, knowing that there's a risk, right? But you have to do it.
Well, I like that Ross said that, because honestly, before my plantar flared, that was me. I went 8 years with no injuries. And honestly, I'm not like, you've seen my form. It's not bulletproof, but strength training, I believe, is what kept me healthy. because I was running, yeah, 90 to 110 miles a week for the last 8 years, basically.
Let's see, Paul, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Stephanie, also. Perhaps this relates to the idea that what Ross was talking about. Historically, for 20 and 30 years, and maybe more, biomechanists have studied running injury, but we're so limited by the methods that we have and what we can measure, and what we haven't measured over all these decades is the actual tissue properties in these runners. And that's only advancing now in more recent years with ultrasound measurements and maybe the instrument that Daryl Thalen is developing. But until we can measure the actual tissues in particular people, we will have difficulty identifying precise causes of running injuries because our measurements are not quite on target. And then related to who we are studying, or this idea about, is strength training good? So we measure groups of people and we have the mean, and our measurements are not that sensitive. But Stephanie, on the other hand, feels her own body, and she knows her own capacities and what she feels like. And maybe to some degree, that's a better measure than when we use force plates and predict internal forces. My point being, I'm not sure, but our measurements are not that sensitive yet to become great at solving running injuries.
Right. And that's a good point. I think if I know a lot of you on the call have done movement analyses and running biomechanic testing and so on and so forth. And I don't know about you, but if someone asked me to assess their biomechanics as a biomechanist, I'm not too sure what's going on. I'm going to measure how they move, and they say, how's my form? I'm like, hey, it looks fine. I don't really know what to say about that, if that makes sense. Even though, again, I should, but we just don't know what's right, because probably there isn't a right thing. And like Paul said, it's pretty irrelevant if you run well or poorly, if you have really a strong ability to withstand whatever's going on. And like Steph said, she says that, the strength training for her has been a big, aspect of her training. And even though the evidence is not there, I think the two pro runners we've talked to, I mean, I bet we can pay them not to train. Do you know what I mean? Like strength train. So it's, well, it depends on the money, I suppose, but.
Yeah, I would be curious to see if you guys ever, like with research, did something where you surveyed massage therapists who work on pro athletes, because I will tell you one thing, a lady that worked on me in Flagstaff for years, she told me, because she knew my tissue because she worked on it. She said that I had the second most, I can't describe, but basically if I had like some knots, they would work out. She could tell that my tissue responded really well, like right away, where she could see other athletes who were like, yeah, their calves were a rock and I could never get in. And she said that my tissue actually recovered like throughout the session of a massage. And she said the only other person that beat me in that feeling to her was Ryan Hall. So it was kind of cool to hear, like, so maybe there is something, that Paul was getting at with tissue. But if you want to go into the research, I would look at massage therapists who work with certain athletes. That's
a good idea. Almost like seeing if there's some perception they have because they touch and feel and
they know our.
Right. Good point.
We have a question from Ben.
Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Steph, I pulled up the article you wrote on your plantar recovery to read after this. I don't know if it goes into that a bit, but on the topic actually of kind of physios and the support people that you have in your corner, I guess in particular, John Ball is someone I've heard a lot, and I've heard about a lot, and it sounds like he's kind of a one of one. But maybe from the perspective of like trying to find someone else like in your own region that operates similarly or does things similarly, like what is it about him and the other successful bodywork people, whatever category you want to call it, what have you found that they do well or that makes them really good?
Yeah, great question. So one, they ask you to run. So they see you come in and present an injury and they see how you run. They ask you context of like, how much running you are doing with your injury, how long it's been going on. And then they ask you like your perception of the injury. So meaning like, when do you think you feel it? Like, and John Ball gets really frustrated because he's like, you've been competing forever. And he's like, do you feel it when you hit the ground or when you push off? And I'll like look at him like he's trying to trick me. And I'll go, when I hit the ground. And he goes, are you sure? And then I say no. So I think someone that can like challenge you and not necessarily, they listen to you as the patient, but then they also like are doing their own theories in their head. And then usually it takes working with someone a few times, I think, to like really like get the relationship. And then not treating the problem that you came in with. So like you said, you have something bugging you in your shin. Well, that person can look up and down the chain and figure out what else might be causing, because more often than not, the injury is not the problem.
Thanks.
And on that, I wonder often, like, I think the best therapists might not worry so much about specific details. They're like a mechanic, right? They're trying to figure out, like, you know, in their mind, this might be wrong. I'm not sure if it's related to the issue, but let's just fix that because it could be. And then, oh, there's another thing that's maybe wrong. Let's fix that as well. And then, it's almost like it's not always a shotgun approach, but in a way, you fix everything you can, and then hopefully this works out, kind of thing. I mean, it's often tough to say like this only one thing, caused that. And so it seems that from what I've heard, Steph, is like John Ball is very holistic in how he approaches things, and he will make sure he treats you as an athlete overall, and might not, necessarily pinpoint one specific thing and only focus on it. And you kind of touched on that a little bit.
One last quality, being able to admit that you're wrong as a therapist, because I had one experience with a therapist years ago, and I had some pain before a race, and I said, I don't think this is right. Like, I think this might be like a stress fracture. And he said, I feel so bad, I will bet my practice that this is not a stress fracture. And I woke up the next day, decided in my gut not to run the race. I went home and got an MRI, and I had a femoral stress reaction. So I feel that guy
Yeah.
practice on me. It
That's
would have been better if he was like, I just am not sure.
Yeah, that's an aggressive bet right there. Well, we're kind of like you're just over an hour here. I would love just to ask you a question, Steph, if you're okay with a little more time here, just about postpartum running. There's so many questions about postpartum running that I didn't really get a chance to ask, but some questions were about like, how do you feel, giving birth, and in your case twice, and whether they're the same perception after each, but did it change your form? Do you feel like it contributed to anything? Like you mentioned, you're injury free for 8 years, and obviously Hudson and Riley are less than 8 years old. So you obviously were injury free while, or after you had them. And so, yeah, maybe some perspective on that, and that might help some therapists or clinicians or other runners on the call.
Sure. You asked if giving birth, that was not easy. It was very challenging.
Sorry. That's not what I meant. I think that's a given. I don't know, but yeah.
Yep. The two experiences were very different. My first son, Riley, I ran about probably 28 weeks into pregnancy, and I would say I ran half the load of what I do. So I maybe got up to about 50 miles a week. And that felt really natural and good. And I just took running if I felt like going 6 miles, I went 6 miles. If I felt like taking the day off, I took the day off. About 20 to 30 weeks is when you sometimes get an increase of blood flow and red blood cells. So I actually felt really good. And I ran a couple races. I ran a mile actually up in Canada. And I did some workouts with the team. But what I did is I just took longer rests. So I was running like 5:20 mile pace for 320 kilometers for like a mile rep, but I would just do 400 on, take 400 rest, and jump back in. So I kind of just modified it to what felt right. And I didn't go off heart rate. I just went off sensory data and how I felt. And then the last 10 weeks, I started to have pain underneath my belly, that round ligament. And that was enough to say, I don't need to run anymore. So I kind of just rested and slept and prepared. And then Riley was a really difficult childbirth. He was faced the opposite direction as he should be. and I ended up having like back labor. But by the time that all happened, I was already 10 centimeters dilated. So it was a natural birth. I couldn't really get any drugs at that point. And I ended up pushing for about 5 hours with him. And then because it was so difficult to get out, I had a grade 4 tear because they did a episiotomy. So and he was 9 pounds and his head was a 90th percentile. So he kind of did a number on me. Coming back from that childbirth was really difficult. I had incontinence for a really long time, and my first run around 8 weeks postpartum, I only made it about 3 minutes because I just felt very heavy and it felt like everything was kind of falling out of me, for lack of a better word. And then I also like lost control of going to the bathroom. So besides being like a professional athlete, I felt very demoralized that I was never gonna make it back because I could barely make it 3 minutes. So I took my time, and then I didn't really know that much about core work or pelvic floor and what I should be doing. And then I was able to connect with a woman, Celeste Goodson, and her business is called Recore Fitness. And she really helped me work on all the intrinsic muscles in your core that get damaged through childbirth and pregnancy. And I needed those to be strong before I could actually get strong externally. And I was kind of on my way back and felt like I was really getting my groove back. I was 6 months postpartum, and we got a little surprise, and I became pregnant with my second child, not on purpose. So that really threw a wrench in kind of my career plans, my Olympic plans, and I guess my life plans. But as you know, life happens when you're busy making other plans. And that childbirth was much easier because I got an epidural, and he was 8 pounds, so a little bit smaller. Yeah, but now I had a 15-month-old and a 1-day-old. So the biggest thing that I did was I just took my time. I realized I was breastfeeding, I was sleep deprived. So I almost approached it like coming back from a really long injury, and I just went week by week. Coach Ben sat down with me, and first week was 15 miles, second week was 30 miles, and we went really slow. And I had a lot of pelvic adductor, like hip pain, and we figured out that I had osteitis pubis, which is a strange injury because it technically is stress fractures of the pelvis, but it is not treated like a stress fracture of the pelvis. They don't say just rest for 10 to 12 weeks. You kind of need to strengthen the supporting areas, and then you need to load it. So that was a really confusing injury for me because almost my aerobic development was way better than my structural coming back. So I ended up running a few races like 7 months postpartum that went super well. But then I think my body caught up to me. And just before the Olympic trials in 2016, the osteitis pubis flared up, and I had a lot of pain in my pelvis. Took about a week off, and then I had a very, very bad race of the trials. And then I really just started rebuilding my body almost from scratch in 2016. Strength train, core work, hip work. Yeah, and that's what I did for the last, whatever, 6 to 7 years. And there's nothing I would have done differently because there was no one that had had 2 babies close together as an athlete. There were not many women who were sharing it. So it kind of inspired me to share my journey in hopes that other women maybe felt more normal in their postpartum comeback, and realize it takes different for everyone, and everyone's on a different timeline.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph. I think it's great to share that. And obviously you've done that really well over the years. And, thanks for the perspective on that. I think, if I would summarize, the chats with you, and then same with Aisha, it's despite our evidence as scientists about, strength training, which seems to be the recurring theme, with your health and success, and, with postpartum, and then with injury reduction and performance even. It seems that there's something there, and we may not be capturing it in the research at the moment, but because it hasn't been done very well, I think it's worth for us to as scientists to realize that perhaps our designs aren't necessarily always perfect, and we can't just disregard what others are saying, especially those at the highest of levels. So thanks so much, Steph, for all that info and for coming on and giving your perspective and answering questions. Really appreciate your time. I'm sure you have another workout to do soon, and there's probably a nap on the horizon coming up, and lunch and whatnot. So we'll let you go. But thanks so much for joining, and thanks again to Novell and Maria and Susan for sponsoring the series. And I'll post a recording on the website as usual if you want to go pick up some of those tidbits of info that were on here.
Thank you. And as always, you guys, Max can share my social, but you can find me if you look up, and if you ever need to message me, I try to do my best to get back to everyone. Yeah, feel free to follow up if there's any questions I did not answer.
Awesome. Thanks, Steph. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep.